I wrote this story for my children, now my grandchildren, and it is called A Christmas Remembered. Mark dropped into bed exhausted. He doubted he could rise early enough in the morning to finish his chores. He lay there, deep in thought, too troubled to sleep. It had been nearly 8 months since his dad had become ill, and his condition had since worsened. He had not wanted to think about his father's failing health, for he could not bear the thought of losing him. Mark was quite worried about his family. Amy had turned 5 the week before, and Jimmy was 9. Mary was 7, and she too had been fighting her share of sickness. Mom was doing all she could to keep cheer in their little country home, but each day brought them all closer to the seriousness of their plight. Uncertainty loomed over their once happy home. Mark was beginning to feel unsure about their prospects for the future. While his dad was ill, Mark had become the man of the house. His part-time job helped put food on the table at a time when living expenses had exhausted their savings. His new responsibilities made him much more aware of how hard his father had worked in the past to provide for his family. He looked toward the window. The shimmering moonlight illumined the tall pines in the yard, making them appear as though strings of lights were hanging off their great branches. It reminded him of a Christmas tree. Suddenly, he felt a mixture of emotions pouring over him. "Why, it's just 4 days before Christmas," he exclaimed. His thoughts turned back to last Christmas. What a festive time it was, but now, with his father's prolonged illness and inability to work, everything had changed. He and his mom had busied themselves making presents for the 3 younger children in hopes of overcoming their disappointment, because this year there would be neither tree nor store-bought gifts. Mark drew back the covers and slowly rose from his bed. The floor felt cold under his bare feet as he moved towards the window. If only there were some way to know Dad would be okay, he thought, as he stared sadly out the window and upwards into the night sky. Tears filled Mark's eyes as his thoughts were flooded with memories of his 12th birthday. His dad had always thought of doing something special for him. This past winter, he had taken him for an overnight stay in the snow-covered hills not far from their home. He remembered his dad's words of love and affection as they shared a campfire meal that moonlit night. "Son, you are growing up, and soon you will be a man. You know your mother and I always want the very best for you. What do you think about the idea of growing up, Mark?" his father asked with sincere interest. "Dad," began Mark, "I would like to have things continue as they are now. I would like to always live at home and help you and Mom." His father gazed tenderly into his son's eyes. "Son, we all grow older, and the time will come when you will have your own family." "I know what you're saying, Dad," interrupted Mark. "But I want you to always be here. I want us never to be apart." His father smiled and then turned thoughtful as he looked out over the hills. "You see those tall pine trees, son? They live a long time, but the day will come when even their great strength will be gone. If they are not cut down before then and used for lumber, their roots will finally lose their grip, and one day even those great trees will fall to the earth." Mark knew his dad was speaking about everyone dying someday. The prospect of death frightened Mark. He wanted so much to believe peace and laughter would always be a part of their little family, and they would always be together. Mark remembered his dad had quickly changed the subject. He was also conscious of a more serious mood as his dad continued. "Mark, I want to share a grave mistake that I have made in my life. You see, son, I have never mixed much with other people, and I can see now that this was wrong. What do you mean, Dad? Mark asked. Mark, don't ever forget what I am about to tell you. I wish I had spent more of my time being a friend to people outside of my own family. I have discovered it is important to have real friends. I want you to have friends, Mark, but to have friends, you must first go out and be a friend. Flames flickered over the campfire as Mark and his father sat in silence. Mark knew his dad was right. Oh, how he loved his father, whom he considered his best friend. But he realized that as far back as he could remember, his parents had devoted themselves to their children and had few friends. Mark pressed his face against the icy window pane. He felt so troubled, so alone, so empty of life. His thoughts turned towards God. He felt a little surprised that he should suddenly be thinking of God, for his family did not go to church. He remembered attending services only a few times when he was a little boy, but how he wanted, at this very moment, to believe there was a God to whom he could reach for help. Suddenly, there came an unexpected shift in the clouds, and Mark found himself enveloped in electrifying moonlight. It was as if the heavens had opened up to him. He stood motionless, for how long he could not tell. Then darkness fell as a cloud covered the moon. He felt a leap of joy within his heart he could not explain. As if in a daze, he reluctantly made his way back into bed and soon fell fast asleep. In his dreams, his vision seemed to continue as he saw the heavens open and a great host of angels filling the sky. They were singing songs of great joy. He strained to hear and could faintly make out the words, "O come, all ye faithful, joyful and triumphant. Come and behold him, Christ the Lord." Mark awoke with a start and rubbed his eyes. I must have been dreaming, he thought. Then, to his surprise, the faint sounds of the song he had heard in his dream could be heard in his room. He could just make out, "Oh, come, let us adore him." He jumped out of bed. His heart raced as he ran over to the window. The moon was now high above the trees, and snow was falling in large flakes. He raised the window, and a gust of cold air swirled snow into his room. "There it is! It's louder this time," he exclaimed. "For you alone are worthy, Christ the Lord." Mark had never heard anything quite like this before. Could it be that God was trying to say something to him? The house closest to theirs belonged to Mr. and Mrs. Thomas. Mark had made no close friends in his neighborhood since he always came directly home from school or went straight to his part-time job. With a shiver, Mark crawled back into bed. He decided he would visit the Thomas house where he thought the songs came from. "Right after I finish with the day's chores tomorrow," he thought. He rose early the next morning. As he entered the kitchen, he was softly singing the song he had heard the night before. His mom bustled around preparing breakfast. "You sure are happy today. Where did you learn that song, Mark?" his mother asked, not waiting for a reply. "When I was a little girl," she continued, "I used to go to church every Sunday with my mom and dad, and I remember singing that song at Christmas. That seemed like so many years ago, and they were the happiest of years." His mother stared into space with a faraway look in her eyes. "Oh, well," she sighed, "you must be hungry. Let's eat together before you do your chores." As they sat at the table, little Amy burst out, "Oh, Mom, do we have to eat oatmeal again? We just had it last night." "Amy," Mother replied, We must be thankful for what we have, and oatmeal is very good for you." Everyone grew quiet as Dad's deep cough filled the house. It seemed worse than the day before. Mark glanced over at his mom and noticed a look of fear written upon her face. He quickly turned away. Mark had many chores and projects that needed his attention during Christmas vacation, but they seemed to go much quicker that day. At 3 o'clock, he was finished with his work and told his mom he was going for a walk with Lady, his dog. Through the snow, Mark and Lady raced and rolled until they neared the house nestled in some tall pines with gently rolling hills as a backdrop. In the front yard, a big snowman was staring at him with black coal eyes. As he approached the door, Mark noticed a woman gathering wood out by the shed. She must be Miss Thomas, he thought. "Hi, my name is Mark Davis. I live about a quarter of a mile down the road." Mrs. Thomas gave him a most pleasant smile he had ever seen. "Hello, Mark. I'm so glad you came by," she replied. "Let me help you with the wood," Mark cheerfully offered as he gathered up the wood box and carried it towards the house. Mrs. Thomas opened the door and Mark emptied the box into the wood bin. At Mark's insistence, Mrs. Thomas let him return to the woodpile several times to finish the task of refilling the wood bin. "It was so good of you to help. Won't you come in for a moment? I have some hot chocolate I just made." Mark hesitated, but her insistent urging and warm hospitality won him over. He took off his wet boots and told Lady to wait outside. Once inside, he could smell the delicious aroma of freshly baked cinnamon bread. Unconsciously, he found himself licking his lips. Mrs. Thomas did not miss a thing. "Mark," she said, "why don't you come over here and sit, and I'll get you some cinnamon bread fresh out of the oven." As she set about preparing a snack for him, Mark's gaze was fixed towards the corner of the room. There was the most beautiful Christmas tree he had ever seen. It towered majestically to the ceiling and sparkled with every kind of ornament and decoration one could imagine. Piles of beautifully wrapped gifts in all shapes and sizes surrounded the tree, adding to the magic and excitement of Christmas. He could not help but wonder what all the packages contained. "There you go," exclaimed Mrs. Thomas, as Mark was startled out of his thoughts. "I was hoping we would meet your family someday," she said. "We stopped by a couple of times last summer to say hello and to see if we could get together, but your mom said you were all very busy." Mark looked up from his hot chocolate and blurted out, "Was there singing here last night?" Mrs. Thomas's eyes widened and were filled with joy as she asked, "Do you mean to say you heard our celebration all the way at your house?" "Yes," replied Mark. "I thought I was dreaming, and then I woke up to a beautiful song that made me feel so peaceful." "What you heard were many families from our church who got together in our home this Christmas season to sing carols of praise to God." Mark lowered his head. He felt sad. He thought of the joyful music he had heard and compared it with the uncertainty and disappointment of his own home. Mrs. Thomas placed a comforting hand on Mark's shoulder. "Tell me, Mark, what is troubling you?" A feeling of warmth crept into his heart. He felt safe and secure in the company of this good lady, much as he imagined it would be with a lifelong friend. So there, in the comfort of that warm, hospitable home, with the logs crackling merrily in the fireplace, he shared with Mrs. Thomas his story and the plight of his family. He also confided in her how he had looked up to heaven the night before and wondered if there was a God. Mrs. Thomas listened with genuine concern and compassion, and gave her full attention as though she had nothing else to do in the whole world but listen to him. When he had finished sharing his troubles, she gave him a motherly hug. "Mark, you said the last thought on your mind before falling asleep last night was a hope that God exists. Our family has come to know God in a very personal way. He not only exists, but we have come to know Him as a loving and caring God. God sent His Son to help families like yours and mine. Mark, God loves you and knows what is on your heart. Before Mark could reply, Mr. Thomas and the Thomas children came bursting through the door. The two girls were laughing and giggling over a funny story their brother John had told them. When they saw Mark, they looked surprised, but their expressions quickly turned to warm smiles to welcome him. Mrs. Thomas introduced Mark as the boy who lived in the farmhouse just up the road. Then she proceeded to introduce her family. This is Mary, and she is 7. Before she could continue, Mark shared with a burst of excitement, I have a sister whose name is Mary also, and she just turned 8. She's such a wonderful girl, you must meet her. Mark's smile soon turned to a more serious look as he added softly, she has been very sick this winter. Mr. Thomas placed a comforting hand on Mark's shoulder and said, Mark, you must tell Mary that when she is well enough, she can come over here and go sledding with our girls. I'm John, interrupted a nice-looking boy about Mark's age. That must be your dog that came up and greeted us just now. Yes, replied Mark, that's Lady, and she is very friendly. At this point, Mrs. Thomas held up her hand as everyone was asking Mark questions all at once. Wait a minute, she said. Give Mark a chance to catch his breath. When the roar of the children's voices subsided, she continued. Mark, this is my Elizabeth, and she just turned 9 last week. After saying hello to each one, Mark looked at John with a warm smile and said, I would very much like to come again and we could play together. John laughed and said, maybe we can have a snowball fight against all the girls. The girls rallied to the challenge, after which Mark turned to Mrs. Thomas, thanked her for her hospitality, and said, Well, I must be getting home now. My mom will be expecting me for dinner. Mrs. Thomas wrapped up the newly baked bread and pressed it into Mark's hands. Giving him a hug, she said, I am so glad I have a new friend. Tell your family Merry Christmas for us. Mark left the Thomas's house with the joyous cries of the children ringing in his ears. He felt less turmoil than he had felt in a long time. The bread was still warm when Mark arrived home in the twilight of evening. Mom gathered the children around the dinner table to enjoy their meager meal. What a feast those tasty loaves were to the children, especially to Amy. In no time at all, it was Christmas Eve. Mrs. Davis was busy rounding up the children. She wanted to start their celebration on time. Outside it was snowing, proclaiming Christmas in the traditional fashion. Christmas had always been Mark's mother's favorite time of year. Over and above all the preparations and the hustle and bustle, there was a simple beauty in Christmas. While she couldn't explain it, she recognized a special blessing seemed to rest upon this day. It was as if the entire world was waiting for something. From the most magnificent home to the humblest of dwellings, there was an air of expectation. With everyone seated in the living room, she lovingly looked over at her husband seated in his rocking chair. Mr. Davis looked pale and drawn, but he managed a weak smile for the sake of his family. As a yearly tradition, each family member would share something really special they liked about each other. They always found more they liked about each other than they disliked. Then they also shared what they would give to each other if they could afford to give the gift of their choice. Each in turn shared, and finally it was Mark's turn. If I could give anything I wanted and had the power to do it, he began, I want Dad to be well again, and loud knocking on the door interrupted him. Jimmy, Amy, and Mary all raced to open it. As the door swung open wide, they stared out into the joyful faces of men, women, and children who blocked the entrance with their smiling presence. Before Mark's family could say anything, the group began to sing, "O come, all ye faithful, joyful and triumphant." By this time, everyone, even Dad, was standing at the door. Mark stared in total astonishment. His dream seemed to come alive again, only this time he was able to see the faces of the singers. It was true they were not angels, as he saw in his dream, but were they not angelic to come out on such a cold and snowy night, caroling to his family? Was this then the true spirit of friendship? Was this not what his dad meant that evening by the campfire? Mark was aroused from his wonderment by Mrs. Thomas, who cried out, "Merry Christmas, Mr. and Mrs. Davis, and Merry Christmas, Mark, Jimmy, Mary, and Amy. Your Mark came and befriended us a few days ago and insisted on helping me with the firewood." Once again, Mark remembered his father's words. "I want you to have friends, Mark, and to have friends, you must first go out and be a friend." Mrs. Thomas continued, "We are friends from church. We all agreed that Christmas would be truly special if we could come and share what we have with you." At that point, the group of people divided. Behind them stood a Christmas tree, wrapped presents, and an abundant supply of food. The Davis family stood speechless. Mark's mother, with tears coursing down her cheeks, said, "How can we ever repay you for your kindness?" Mr. Thomas replied, "If you would allow us to pray for your family, it would be thanks enough." How they ever crowded over 25 people with the tree and all the packages and gifts into that little house, no one will ever know. But the thing they will always remember is the loving, caring group of Christians who reached out and touched Mark's father and his sister Mary and prayed with a simplicity they had never heard before. These neighbors sought God's help on this Christmas Eve as simply as a child would ask for something from his father or mother. And God heard. On Christmas morning, Mark's family was up early, singing Jingle Bells and Frosty the Snowman and laughing with joyous hearts. As they sat down to breakfast, the oven-fresh bread filled the house with its delightful aroma. Mark noticed his dad was, for the first time in a long while, in his familiar chair at the table. Even his cough had greatly subsided. He and Mary had both somehow improved immensely during the night. The family was happily reminded of their special visitors the night before, on Christmas Eve. That Sunday, Mark went to church with his whole family. They felt very much at home in the midst of their new friends who had reached out to them in a spirit of love. It was this love that won them to Christ, the same love they now share with others. In later years, when Mark had his own family, he would always gather them around the tree on Christmas Eve, and they never tired of hearing the story of how he and his father had shared a campfire meal together on a moonlit night. He would then repeat his father's words, "Mark, I want you to have friends, but to have friends, you must first go out and be a friend." Mark enjoyed many more happy Christmas Eves in his lifetime, and he always read to his children, but none were more remarkable than that Christmas when families from the church came to his doorstep, showing his family such love and generosity. And that is why it will always remain for him a Christmas remembered.